A pleasant morning to everyone. We are now live on YouTube. Good morning. It's 10 minutes past 10. I'm Patricia Silvestre, and in behalf of the Graduate Studies Program, the Department of Musicology, and the UP College of Music, I'd like to welcome everyone to Dr. Miranda's talk this morning, 10 a.m. Philippine time and 9 p.m. for EC in Nashville. Dr. Chris Moico, head of the Graduate Studies Program, will be joining us later for our forum. EC's talk is titled Samahang Gabriel and the Myth of the Sarsuwela's Decline. Let me just read the abstract for everyone. In the 1920s and 30s, the Tagalog Sarsuwela stage continued to be a vibrant space where local writers, artists, and musicians creatively responded to the changing social conditions of US colonial rule in the Philippines. While early proponents of the Sarsuwela had the dual goal of educating its Tagalog audience and providing entertainment for colonial elites, later practitioners of the genre worked towards creating a performance practice by and for the working classes. The Samahang Gabriel was prolific in this later period, and their repertoire challenges the oft-repeated narrative that the Sarsuwela was quickly displaced by the advent of film and vaudeville in the Philippines. Instead, Sarsuwela productions from this period closely intertwined with these other forms of entertainment. Moreover, sound recordings and Tagalog literature gave the Sarsuwela a boost in popularity in the late 1920s, even as contemporary critics and later historians eulogized its decline. Librettos were adopted for the screen, while Tagalog short stories and novels, serialized in popular magazines, were rewritten as zarzuelas in the 1930s. This transmedial nature of popular entertainment in the Philippines underlines the continued performance of the zarzuela, even in the age of newly emerging technologies. Rather than framing these different platforms as oppositional, this presentation illustrates how zarzuelistas embraced new media and became part of a larger network of an emerging popular entertainment industry in the Philippines. Our speaker, Miranda, is currently a postdoctoral scholar at Vanderbilt University. She received her PhD in musicology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research has been supported by various grants, including the American Musicological Society's Resident Fellowship at the Newberry Library and the Mellon Research Fellowship on Original Sources by the Council for Library and Information Resources. She is at work on a book manuscript on the Sarsuwela, cultural nationalism, and constructions of racial and gendered identities in the performing arts. EC is also a violinist, having earned degrees in performance at the University of the Philippines and at Western Illinois University. where she was a member of the Jostrom String Quartet. She has performed in ensembles such as the Manila Symphony Orchestra, the Asian Youth Orchestra, and in the Wisconsin-based band Foro Fo Show, playing Northeastern Brazilian dance music. Let us all welcome into our virtual spaces Dr. Isidora Miranda.
Thank you, Professor Silvestre, for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank Dr. Muico and Dean Vern de la Peña for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you all. I'm a little bit nervous because I have all my college professors in the room this evening. I hope I do you proud, and really, really excited to be here with you all in this virtual space. Let me share my screen. I hope you can all see the screen, correct? All right, so I'm gonna make sure that, okay, awesome. So before I begin, I want to kind of talk very briefly about the kind of larger book project, which is in its very, very early stages, to just give you a context of this history, right? This book project is a history of the transformation of the Sarsuwela into a vernacular practice in the Philippines as the archipelago transitioned from a Spanish to a United States colony. The book re-examines claims to Filipino nationhood during a fraught period when debates about nationalism were made not only in the political arena, but also on the theatrical stages of Manila. Critically, the book underscores, or the book will underscore, how questions of race and ethnicity, class and gender account for the ideological dissonances that accompanied different local responses to colonialism through the performing arts, and how these questions lay bare the often problematic ways that identity and difference are constructed in the Sarsuelas. So this is kind of the broader project with its kind of working title, Colonial Dissonance, Tagalog Sarsuela and the Politics of Difference in the Philippines. One big caveat here is that I am primarily looking at Tagalog language sources. So my focus is largely on the Tagalog repertoire, which is very important to highlight. The Tagalog repertoire is but one among many other vernacular traditions in the Philippines. A lot of folks have written about other, other Philippine language Sarsuelas. Doreen Fernandez, of course, has worked on Iloilo Sarsuela. Crisalina Legasto on Pangasinan. I think Julieta Malyari has also written about Kapampangan. So there's a lot of people that have worked on other traditions, and of course, Professor Nicanor Chongson has worked done a lot of work on kind of the broader history of theater and performance in the Philippines. My work, my project, kind of is looking like this at the moment. I have 6 chapters. These chapters track the development of the Sarsuela in the Philippines against the backdrop of multiple colonial impositions. In the first 3 chapters, I look at the early history of the genre from the importation of Spanish repertoire and the locally produced Sarsuelas in Spanish. The second and third chapters will focus mostly on the kind of transition to Tagalog through the work of Severino Reyes. In these chapters, I'll talk about the Comedia Sarsuela debates and the ways that racial and ethnic difference is presented on the Sarsuela stage, which then animated questions of Filipino modern identity and respectability under the U.S. Colonial rule. The latter 3 chapters move through the 1920s and 30s as the Sarsuela became part of a network of popular entertainment and its national anxieties toward rapid Americanization and commercialism. In this presentation that I'm going to share with you today is part of that latter half of the history of the Sarsuela that I'm constructing. So I'll start. In March 1932, an article in Manila's Spanish language newspaper, La Vanguardia, announced the decline of the Sarsuela and waxed nostalgic about the golden age of Tagalog theater, when coliseums were filled to capacity as in 1902 and in 1904. Proclaiming Severino Reyes as the, quote, main hero of the glorious past of the Tagalog theater, end quote, the article took stock of the playwright's popular works alongside famous artists of the first decades of the 20th century. The author argued further that the decreasing popularity of the Sarsuwela was due to factors including the lack of professionalism and diminished competency of the artists, authors, and composers. More tellingly, the article pointed to the general lack of interest in Sarsuelas among the local Tagalog audience. The author claimed that former patrons of the Sarsuela had diverted their attention to newer forms of entertainment like the cinema and the profane, good-for-nothing vaudeville here in the news clipping Mequetrefe Vaudeville. The narrative of the decline of the Tagalog Sarsuelas in Manila and other urban centers, however, obscures the fact that outside the bigger theaters and venues in Manila, Sarsuelas continued to be performed and were integral in the formation of a local popular entertainment industry in the later decades of the U.S. colonial period. Through a survey of the repertoire of the Malaking Samahang Sarsuela at Opereta Gabriel, or Samahang Gabriel, this paper revises the oft-repeated account that Sarsuelas were displaced by the advent of vaudeville or vaudeville and film as mass entertainment, and by the proliferation of U.S. American popular music in the Philippines. Pushing against the simplistic account of Americanization of Filipino culture, I elaborate on these latter decades of the 1920s and 30s as a pivotal moment when the Sarsuela stage became a point of convergence between local print media, Tagalog poetry, and popular music and dance. The Samahang Gabriel repertoire points to the astounding rise of popular fiction serialized in Tagalog newspapers and magazines, and the reemergence of Tagalog poetry, which had found its way into various spoken and performative practice. Cultural elites of the period, like our La Vanguardia author, on the other hand, dismissed these vernacular publications as inferior to Philippine literature written in English, along with the rise of American popular music and dance, especially in the vaudeville stages. These critiques reflect the bifurcated notion of high and low art, which subsequently reinforced the narrative of decline within existing literature on the history of the Sarsuela in the Philippines. How then do we account for the continued performance of the Tagalog Sarsuela amidst the gaining popularity of other forms of entertainment? I argue that it is more accurate to represent the Sarsuela's later development in the late 1920s and 30s, not so much as a decline, but rather a shift in terms of its main contributors, the spaces where Sarsuelas were performed, and the audiences for the new repertoire. The Tagalog Sarsuela's first advocates, such as Severino Reyes, envisioned the Sarsuela as a vehicle for didacticism and cultural uplift of his Tagalog audiences, and as entertainment for Manila's cosmopolitan elites. The playwrights of Reyes' ilk were, in effect, the very wealthy patrons who bankrolled the stage productions in the larger theater venues, or at the very least had the social capital and networks to rally financial support to fund the performances. The emphasis on Severino Reyes and his Gran Compañía in historical accounts, however, overlooks and marginalizes the less popular but still active companies of the later decades. In addition, writers of the period and later historians linked Reyes' switch to journalism to the end of the Tagalog Sarsuelas. Some of you may know that by the early 20s, Severino Reyes switched to writing and editing for the Liwayway magazine. The Manila bias in the histories of the Sarsuela in the Philippines adds to this narrative of decline in which film and vaudeville have been characterized as dominating cultural phenomena, especially in the colonial capital. This undermines accounts of Sarsuela companies touring outside of Manila and in neighboring provinces, performing in non-traditional venues within the capital, including in cinema houses, and how they relied on other performance opportunities such as town fiestas and local community events. By the 1920s and 30s, Sarsuela companies like Samahang Gabriel were run by less affluent directors, writers, artists, and musicians who mined the growing body of popular literature and music to entertain its local Tagalog audience. Through a closer look at key Samahang Gabriel repertoire and music, I'll demonstrate how the Sarsuelas of the later decades not only represent a crucial stage in the standardization of writing music for the Tagalog theatrical stage, but also illustrate how the use of jazz and other popular genres paralleled an often ambivalent and playful reflection on modernity and foreign cultural influences similarly found in the Sarsuela's texts. So, first, let me introduce the archive. The bulk of the Samahang Gabriel's repertoire can be found in the Manlapas collection, an archive of works housed at the Pardo de Tavera Special Collections at the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, consisting of about 70 plus titles, almost 80 titles. The Manlapas collection is a rich resource of Tagalog zarzuelas, operetas, plays, and comedias from 1890 to about 1941. The majority of the works in the collection are zarzuelas, and about 29 titles, potentially more, belong to the Samahang Gabriel repertoire. And here I've kind of just shown you the working chart that I've been kind of working on and kind of plugging in more information about these different titles that comprise the Samahang Gabriel repertoire. It is important to note here how playwrights and companies began to use the Tagalog zarzuela or Sarsuwela with the S instead of Zarzuela with a Z, which Severino Reyes and others used in the earlier repertoire. The Samahang Gabriel also used the term opereta, which is the Tagalog variant of operetta. And there seems to be no clear distinction between Sarsuwela and operetta, and both terms were used interchangeably. The Samahang Gabriel was active for about 20 years prior to the outbreak of the Second World War and was primarily based in Santa Cruz, Manila. Artists who had a long history of performing in zarzuelas in other groups formed the Samahang Gabriel. The group was managed by Eusebio Gabriel, who also served as an actor. The company also included Felisa Benaventura, Danding Gabriel, Rading Gabriel, and Nenita Gabriel. So it's very much a family business, right? A family company. Eusebio and Felisa previously had ties to the Severino Reyes Gran Compañía Sarsuela de Tagala, and here are some kind of personnel for some of the scripts. You see here the roster of artists in the group. There's also Germana Corte that took some of the other leading roles in the Samahang Gabriel repertoire. So Eusebio and Felisa Gabriel previously had ties to Severino Reyes' Gran Compañía de Sarsuela Tagala, including top-billing the 1918 production of Cinematographo written by Jose Maria Rivera and with music by Gavino Carluen. And also in Ang Liham ng Ligaya, where they were joined by Bernardino Benaventura, who was already a well-known playwright at that time and became the main playwright for Samahang Gabriel. Some of Bernardino Benaventura's works, original works, are Pinaglupitan ng Tadhana, Babaeng Banal, Mapait na Tagumpay, and Ang Takas. He also adapted no less than 20 additional titles for the Sarsuela stage for the Samahang Gabriel repertoire. Danding Gabriel was the main musician of the family, who arranged and transcribed music for the company in the 1930s, occasionally taking on acting roles, including the lead in Malambot na Bato or Soft Stone in 1937, where he portrayed a struggling musician caught in a marriage of convenience. He was also the visual artist of the group, illustrating covers of Sarsuela scores and scripts, as shown here. So it's very kind of creative, visually and musically. Prior to his direct involvement with the Samahang Gabriel, Danding was active in the vaudeville and in the early days of studio recording, arranged novelty songs written by Francisco Santiago and Nicanor Abelardo, for example, and performing with Santiago's orchestra. Other artists like Felisa Benaventura, Gabriel recorded songs and excerpts of dialogues from earlier Sarsuela repertoire, along with Eusebio Gabriel and other Sarsuelistas like Joaquin Gavino and Juanita Angles. Many other artists like Atang de la Rama, Nati de Arellano, as I played kind of an excerpt before we started. And of course, the famous Maria Carpena recording of Ang Maya from the earlier Sarsuela Filipinas para los Filipinos. These artists and these examples are some of the kind of early recordings that we have. And these recordings attest to the ways in which the Sarsuela stage provided the musical content and artists for the fledgling recording industry in the Philippines. The roster of composers who collaborated with Samahang Gabriel includes Jose Z. Rivera, Pablo Navarro, Alejo Carluen, Liberato Samala, Atong Pineda, and of course, Leon Ignacio. Their Sarsuwela scores reveal developments in setting music for the theatrical stage in the later decades of the US colonial period. While claims of the Tagalog Sarsuela's decline posit the scarcity of competent composers and quality music, a survey of the collection actually points to a more standardized practice in scoring for the Tagalog stage, such as the total number of songs, about 20 numbers on average, spread over the 3 or sometimes 4 acts of the Sarsuela, and the more clear-cut separation between the song numbers and instrumental music, what are commonly referred to as incidental music in theater. These instrumental sections became more prominent in the Samahang Gabriel repertoire and were used for scene changes and in emphasizing the affective mood of certain scenes, often marked as cuadro, melodia, and música fuerte in the scores. The incidental music perform a narrative function in driving the dramatic unfolding of the plot. The cuadro, which varies in length, often comes after the opening curtain, the telong pambungad, and during a change of scene. The melodia and música fuerte, on the other hand, are used to set the mood or heighten the dramatic intensity of certain scenes. In addition, the melodia often features a solo violin or cello and is used in night scenes, in quiet but intensely dramatic moments, and in scenes when a family member's death, usually a parent, brings about a tragic resolution in the drama. At other times, the melodia accompanies particularly intense dialogues and serves as necessary background music to pivotal denouement scenes. The música fuerte, on the other hand, is often short and accompanies a tense or violent action, or functions as a coda-like section at the end of a cliffhanger scene as the curtain comes down, the telón rápido. I want to play one musical example of another kind of incidental music from Ang Mangingisda, or The Fisherman, from 1927, which is adapted from Nieves Baen's short story. This instrumental section is labeled Tempestad, number 7 here, and accompanies a sea storm scene that devastates a fishing community in Abukay, where the Sarsuela, Ang Mangingisda, is set. Jose Z. Rivera's piano score represents a deadly tempest with continuous tremolos in the bass line and repetitive scalar sequences, passages that goes up and down, simulating sounds of thunder. The music abruptly, you'll hear the music abruptly slow down and segues into the ensemble number closing the first act. The chorus sings of the calamity that befell them as the protagonist Luisa desperately cries for the safety of her husband Sencho, who was last seen braving the turbulent waters. So this is the musical number Tempestad from Ang Mangingisda. I want to thank Professor April Merced Nisa for recording that excerpt. I'm seriously lacking piano skills, as Professor Aldeco, my college piano teacher, can attest. So thank you, Professor Nisa, for your assistance. So the occurrence of incidental music in the later Sarsuwela repertoire parallels Western musical melodrama, in which dramatic action is facilitated by music played in between spoken texts, as well as an accompaniment to actors' dialogues and emotive speeches. Although the practice of melodrama and stage plays varies in practice since the 18th century and across different European and later American traditions, the use of short musical passages to carry out specific situational and emotional content of plots remains a common feature. As a general term in theater and later film studies, film scholar Maureen Turim defines melodrama as characterized by, quote, elements of stage production tending toward expressive excess, the repetitive casting of character types in moral dilemmas and physical dangers, the circumstantial convergence of events, and the blending and juxtaposition of conflicting tones, end quote. The later repertoire of Tagalog Sarsuelas exhibit these elements, and the highly emotional work that the musical score brings heightens the melodramatic content of the typical plots of the Samahang Gabriel repertoire. So the plots of the Samahang Gabriel repertoire focused on family dramas that explore socioeconomic difference and domestic hardships, alongside aspirational stories of social mobility through education and migrant labor. Other related themes and plot lines deal with issues of social dignity and morality, marital infidelity, secret identities and hidden parentage, gambling, sexual immodesty, and the polarized but still interconnected values that represent urban and rural life. In these Sarsuelas, images associated with the urban, often Manila, and the rural began to animate the class tensions that drive the Sarsuelas plots. This urban-rural divide manifests itself in conflicts between the city's educated elite and the largely agrarian laborers of the countryside. Sarsuelas like Deo from 1928, Ang Mga Isda, as I've kind of excerpted, and Makiling are set outside of Manila and portray the difficult life of farmers, fishermen, and the rural working class. In these stories, the narrative of kahirapan or suffering portray the experiences of the provinciana as victims of the matapobre, haughty elite. However, the antagonists typically realize the injustice of their actions, ask forgiveness from their once victims, and redeem themselves by the end of the Sarsuela. Many of these very emotional and realist stories were likely already quite familiar with the Sarsuela audience, since the bulk of Bernardino Benaventura's scripts for Samahang Gabriel are adaptations of serialized stories appearing in weekly magazines in the 1920s and 30s. Out of about 29 titles in the Samahang Gabriel repertoire, 8 stories first appeared in Luwayway magazine, while a few others were printed in Taliba, Ang Mithi, and Sampaguita. These stories were penned by writers Gregorio Coching, Fausto Galauran, Nieves Baens, later Del Rosario, and Teodoro Viray. Other titles were adapted from novels written by more established authors, Remigio Mat Castro and Lazaro Francisco, such as Castro's Makiling and Francisco's Ama and Pamana ng Pulubi. At first glance, these adaptations may seem to support what Amelia La Peña Bonifacio had observed as the decline of the role of the playwright in the Tagalog Sarsuela. But Benaventura's adaptations demonstrate a mastery in translating for the stage and make a strong case for considering theatrical adaptations as complete works in themselves. Unlike librettos written in the earlier decades, including Severino Reyes's, Benaventura's scripts use the Tagalog language almost exclusively throughout, including much more descriptive stage actions, stage directions, and settings. In the earlier repertoire, and including Severino Reyes's, librettos, the stage directions would often be in Spanish, right? In this later repertoire, it will all be almost exclusively in Tagalog. In some instances, the script is more direct in giving additional cues for line deliveries and deliberate pauses to heighten moments of suspense and emotionally intense scenes, highlighting Benaventura's dual role as playwright and director. Another noticeable feature is the sharp contrast between steady conversational dialogues and the abrupt, versified lines that emphasize a particular character's emotional and psychological state or address moral faults. These dodecasyllabic verses, these 12, 12 syllables in a line verses often extol a particular virtue or act as moralizing lines by the main characters. For the sake of time, I have only included here one example from Isang Regalo de Boda from 1927, where Dolores, the protagonist, poetically talks back at her adoptive parents, an older sibling who resents her and is giving her a hard time at home. And here, Dolores kind of has this two stanza here, and I have here the second stanza where she says, "Dami ng mayabang sa lupa'y lumagpak, dami ng naapi ng mapagmataas. Ang buhay ng tao ay palipat-lipat, ang dukha sa ngayon dakila na bukas." The brevity of the poetic lines effectively conveys the emotional weight that characters experience and underlines specific topics connected to the larger theme of a particular sarsuela. The metered and rhyming scheme of the spoken verses act as interruptions to the flow of otherwise conversational dialogues and assume an explicit role as the voice of reason and truth-telling within the confines of the plot. Contrary to this narrative of decline, not only of the sarsuela, but also Philippine literature more broadly, the overwhelming recurrence of spoken verses in Buenaventura's scripts reflects the renaissance of Tagalog poetry and echoes the popularity of the local debating in verse called balagtasan. The balagtasan, first introduced in 1924, consists of two poets debating over a topic in verse. And here, balagtasan topics often include debating the merits of older, quote, traditional Filipino practices versus modern ones, modern foreign ones. By 1928, balagtasan was so widespread that the Sarsuela Deo included one in its opening fiesta scene where two characters debated the virtues of the youth versus those of the older generation, ang kabataan at katandaan. In the Sarsuela Makiling, the trope of the old versus the new translated into a debate over which form of transportation is most advantageous, the kalesa or the automobile. In the end, the judges declared a tie, stating that both debaters became too personal and hot-headed in their exchanges. These tensions between older practices perceived as inherently Filipino and of modern ones tagged as foreign and Western can be found in other places throughout the script. New trends in fashion is another favorite topic and are seen as either harmless vanities or serious threats to Filipino values. Debates over socially acceptable modes of dress and behavior targeting young Filipino women, for example, were often deployed with severity in tone and strongly associate women's fashion choices with their sexual modesty and virtue. One example found in X Tres X, where having bobbed hair was seen as contrary to Filipino traditions. On the other hand, men, often secondary characters, sporting shaved eyebrows and wide-legged London-style pants, appear as comic relief and poked fun at for their fashion choices. In Mga Bilanggo ng Pag-ibig or Prisoners of Love from 1927, for example, one character, Minong, introduces himself as lalaking pangkasalukuyan or man of today, a la Rudolph Valentino. Minong boldly claims that if the Americans could only see all Filipinos dressed as he is, then the Philippines would quickly be given independence. Another minor character, Tikyo, responds, laughs in response and retorts that if given the power, he would create a law that would sentence anyone looking like Minong to 30 years in prison. So these caricatures of the dandy-like figure would quickly become a popular icon in Filipino comics in the form of Kenkoy, who made his debut in Liwayway magazine in 1929. As literary critic Soledad Reyes remarks, Kenkoy demarcates the, quote, line between modern and traditional Filipinos, between the trendy and the conservative, and between the new and the old, end quote. Yet, as Soledad Reyes further argues, the stories and imageries in Kenkoy point to the more ambiguous responses to the constant fascination with things US American, which captured the inherent, quote, tensions and contradictions of colonial society. In effect, the world of Kenkoy is the world of the Tagalog Sarsuela of the 1920s and 30s, where the old and new coexisted in playful ambivalence. And if we look beyond the more prescriptive tone of some of the scripts and look at the world of Sarsuelistas themselves, we see this combination of the trendy and the traditional. Elsewhere, I've talked about the artist Atang de la Rama, who's known for always wearing her terno throughout her career as a very conscious expression of her Filipino identity while wearing trendy, short, wavy hairstyles. De la Rama also performed in the vaudeville circuit in the 1920s, along with building a long career in film, radio, and the Sarsuela stage as artist, playwright, and producer. But even as she was known for her renditions of Tagalog songs that earned her the moniker Queen of the Kundiman and cemented her image as the Demure Dalagang Bukid, she was also occasionally seen in risque performances in the vaudeville stage. One reviewer of the Savoy Nifties comments, for example, how the quote, demure little queen of Kundiman steps out with some of the most wicked scandal stuff imaginable, and she gets away with it, end quote. Although I'd love to talk more about Atang de la Rama, I think my point here is that one cannot talk about the continued performance of the Tagalog Sarsuela without acknowledging its ties to the larger landscape of popular entertainment of the 1920s and 30s, and that includes the vaudeville stage and the influx of American popular music. Within existing literature on Filipino culture, vaudevilles beginnings in the Philippines as a foreign import and its ties to U.S. military entertainment at the turn of the 20th century fueled vaudeville's reputation as a primarily American practice that rarely reflected contemporary Filipino society. But Filipino performers were also participating and creating new vaudeville performances locally by the 1920s. And Professor Arwin Tan, in his talk, few months ago, I think, mentioned this, right? Talks a lot about this, as well as other scholars who talk about jazz and U.S. Empire, Fritz Schenker and Peter Kepi talks about this kind of these performance stages. Further, vaudeville in the 1920s offered an eclectic program of song and dance number, not restricted to U.S. popular music and jazz. Peter Kepi cites, for example, Cebu-born Luis Borromeo, for example, who referred to his early shows not so much as vaudeville, but rather as a, quote, review of the classical jazz music, operatic, and classical song, which also included songs in Tagalog and other Philippine languages. For Manila's moralists and staunch nationalists of the period, however, as again the La Vanguardia quote I began with reflects, vaudeville's reputation as peddling in vulgarity also likely fueled the devaluation of any new Tagalog Sarsuelas for their affinity to popular music and culture of this period that was by this time referred to under the larger label of jazz. Critics of American jazz as a corrupting influence on creating a sense of national music was not unique, right, to the Philippine context. These debates were happening in the US and in other cultural hubs like Paris, London, and especially Berlin, where jazz would become synonymous with racial degeneracy as Nazis took power. In the Philippines, American Robert Schofield, Dean of the UP Conservatory of Music from 1920 to 1924, asserted in 1922 that jazz was a sickness in the music of the Philippines, much like in the US, and posed a danger to the integrity of Filipino musicians. Such critiques of contemporary popular music also became entangled with the rhetoric and musical nationalism circulating at this time. In his 1931 publication, The Development of Music in the Philippine Islands, composer Francisco Santiago criticized the, quote, cheap dance music flooding the local music scene and the native composer's adoption of, quote, American airs, old cakewalk, the noisy March of Sousa, and the deafening and somewhat distorted jazz. Yet, quite ironically, Santiago also praised Sarsuela composers such as Juan Hernandez, Nicanor Abelardo, and Francisco Bencamino, all of whom had dabbled in jazz idioms in their compositions. These commentaries underline the debates between high and low art that preoccupied composers and intellectuals of the period, and their anxieties about American influence and in popular culture. However, the popular dance genres and U.S. novelty songs were not only heard on the vaudeville stages of Manila, but also populated the Sarsuela scores of the later decades. Early jazz became a kind of musical currency in the Sarsuela stage as much as it did in the vaudeville circuit. The eclecticism found in the vaudeville programming of Borromeo Lu or Luis Borromeo also paralleled that of the new Sarsuwela composers' mixing of older operetta fare, such as arias, waltzes, and tangos, with the newer jazz music, as well as local song and dance genres. In other words, the vaudeville and Sarsuwela stages' soundscapes could not have greatly differed from each other. A closer look at the scores of the Samahang Gabriel repertoire reveals the liberal use of globally popular genres as means to comment on the local and everyday colonial life in the Philippines. These genres include the older ragtime music, foxtrots, blues, the Charleston, and even the Hawaiian hula. These appear as newly created songs and sometimes as insertions of pre-existing songs that had become popular in the US colony. As you may not notice, these popular music are dance music genres, and so these are often found in cabaret scenes or scenes that reference dancing, in dialogues where new modes of practice are contrasted with the old, as I had mentioned above, or in scenes that poke fun at contemporary social vices. A dance sequence, for example, appears in the Sarsuwela Ang Dugong Makamandag, song number 20, where a trio of minor characters plus the chorus sing about the delights of whiskey. The song begins with a waltz as the verses are sung and then shifts into slow section marked as blues and labeled as a tap dance as the characters kind of slowly get happy. In Jose Z. Rivera's Ang Mangingisda, comic characters Kileto and Kileta launch into a lengthy duo that moves in multiple sections of slow foxtrot, one-step, blues, hula, and waltz marked throughout the score manuscript. Another example from Deo after the opening Balagtasan scene that I mentioned earlier, a one-step song number 3, comes up where the duo Adela at Elvira sing of the youthful delights of dancing, the one-step, the blues, and the Charleston. And then finally, I have one other example from Cruz na Bulaklak, where comedic couple Teban and Idang sing a duo about imported fashion trends in the form of a Vestidang Americana. At the beginning of the song, Idang shows off her very smart, the English is in the lyrics, her very smart form-fitting dress for dancing. The song switches to the distinctive Hispano-Filipino jota when Teban objects to Idang's choice of clothing and fears that she might leave him for another man attracted by her new dress. A final section marked medium swing ends the song as the couple sings together in reprise. Ito'y modang sakdal inam na sa ating nababagay, hatid ng dayuhan sa gisag ng kabihasnan, maging bata't matandaman sa bestida'y umiinam, kahit hindi nababagay sa moda ay sumusunod lamang. And here in this text, it's also interesting how it's kind of very contradictory too in the ways that it talks about the fashion as something good and becomes us, but also towards the end, even if it does not suit us, some would just keep following, what is fashionable or what is trendy. Indeed, these dance music genres populate the scores, making the Sarsuwela stage the primary place where Tagalog audiences who have no access to other forms of entertainment like the vaudeville and sound recordings heard these new music. As one article published in 1929 in the magazine Pagkakaisa comments, maging dito sa Pilipinas na naging libangan na yata ang katutubong arte esceniko o ang tinatawag nating dulaan, ang jazz ay namamaibabaw sa ibang mga tugtugin kahit sang gaano kalambing. Ang jazz ay siyang tumalo at nagpatabi sa tango. Sa bawat 10 foxtrots na Hawaiano ay 2 lamang tugtuging Argentino ang napapasalit. At ang valse ay parang nahihiyang nagtatago sa alinmang alituntunin ng kasayahan sa pag-aalalang mainis sa mga sigat at garalgal jazz. And titled Ang Tagumpay ng Isang Venus na Itim, the article is cognizant of jazz as a form of Black art and, more importantly, puts emphasis on its global popularity as a triumph of Black music. This narrative of triumph is reminiscent of the ethos of the 1920s Harlem Renaissance in its celebration of African-American creativity. This commentary also ran contrary to the disparaging comments on jazz circulating among Manila's literati at that time. Note here too that the author is not saying that these new jazz music is quickly replacing indigenized genres, but the erstwhile ubiquitous tango and waltzes, which were the popular dance musics of the earlier decades. This points to the rather consistent practice among composers of incorporating whatever kinds of music were currently popular in their Sarsuwela scores. Alongside the abundant use of jazz genres, the Sarsuwela scores of this later repertoire readily incorporated local genres such as the kundiman, balitaw, the jota, as mentioned earlier, and danzas. This is particularly remarkable given that the Sarsuwela scores of the earlier decades do not exhibit this practice save for rare examples. The kundiman in particular are often used as simple love songs or laments sung in moments of overwhelming grief and suffering as part of the narrative of kahirapan portrayed in the Samahang Gabriel Sarsuelas. These songs are often sung by women and tell stories of hardship and the fate of deserted wives, forgotten mothers, and detested sisters. In Alejo Carluen's Babaeng Banal, for example, a kundiman is sung by Deli and her daughter as they beg for food after Deli was blinded by poison and later abandoned by her husband, Dario. Ines's aria from Makiling is a kundiman sung as a lullaby as the young mother yearns for the child forcibly taken from her. These and many other examples of kundimans in the Sarsuela added to the popularity of the genre, as much as current literature attributes its rise through a handful of composers like Santiago and Abelardo. Taken as a whole, the variety of musical examples and crucial dramatic moments within the Samahang Gabriel repertoire tell a much richer story of how the Tagalog Sarsuelas developed in the later decades of the 1920s and 30s. To understand this development comprehensively, the careers of artists and the content of later repertoire must be read alongside the beginnings of a popular entertainment industry that emerged in this period. The rise in film and commercial recordings not only bolstered the Sarsuela stage, but created an interdependent environment where playwrights, theater artists, and musicians depended on these various performing platforms for new opportunities and new material. In the same vein, a simplistic view that 1920s popular music and culture can only be defined as either US, American, or Filipino completely fails to recognize the ways in which music theater and other forms of artistic practice are part of larger networks of circulation and consumption. The Samahang Gabriel repertoire, with its distinctive set of themes that tackle socioeconomic disparities and its playful and strategic use of popular music, demonstrates the Sarsuela's continued relevance in Filipino colonial society. While Sarsuela productions remain few and far between in the post-war period, the perception of the Sarsuela as an essentially anti-colonial and subversive theatrical form persists strongly in historical narratives of the genre. Much work is needed in reconstructing a longer history of the Sarsuela in the Philippines, especially as it intersected with the emergence of other forms of popular entertainment and helped create an industry that continues to rely on content and aesthetics familiar to the Sarsuela stage. Filipino films during the first few decades post-World War II and even later in television featured storylines and themes of hardship, social mobility, and domestic melodramas found in the Sarsuelas of the 1930s. The lingering popularity and almost cultish emphasis on love themes and the stereotypical bida, contra bida characters can be seen as a continuation of the character types that were first featured in the Tagalog theater. Likewise, the popular music industry that emerged post-war retains the sounds of the Sarsuela stage. The popular ballads of the 1950s and 60s and the heavily orchestrated tracks found in recordings from this period echo the previous decade's aesthetics of sentimentality that accompanied the melodramas of the later Sarsuela repertoire. These post-war resonances continue to reflect the nature of the Sarsuela as a multivalent form of music theater and its lasting influence in Philippine popular entertainment. Salamat.
Thank you very much. Thank you, EC, Dr. Miranda, for your talk. We are looking forward to your forthcoming book, as this will certainly be a formidable contribution to the existing scholarship and repertoire of Philippine Sarsuela. At this point, I'd like to call in the head of the Graduate Studies program. Join me, Dr. Christine Moico. We will have our forum.
Okay, hi everyone. It's also very timely because she mentioned about Samahang Gabriel as also a venue by which women's issues are also brought up. You know, and it's timely because it's Women's Month. So,
Yes.
ganda yung topic swak na swak with also with what's your lecture, no? So I'm going to read comments and questions from YouTube while Dr. Pat's going to read your comments and issues here. So you're free to post your questions anywhere, YouTube or Zoom. No, go ahead, and we're going to read the questions. Okay. Um, you see any questions posted here? If, audience, go ahead and write your questions. Okay, let me consult YouTube while Dr. Sylvester is going to read your chat here on Zoom.
Uh, well, there are some comments here on the chat. Thanks, EC, from Dada. This is wonderful and exciting work. Looking forward to your book. Here's a question from Dr. Buen Consejo. How many samahans were there in the 1920s and the 1930s?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. It's kind of hard to reconstruct and kind of I think my sense is that in the 20s and 30s, you can kind of think about the companies and the samahans as kind of a little bit more fluid. I mean, I could think of maybe five. The Samahang Gabriel, Florentino Balacer had his own kumpanya. Atang de la Rama in the late 30s would create her kind of own group, albeit it's kind of short-lived, right? And then you have the Gran Compañía de Sarsuwela Tagala, which kind of stayed on for a while up to the kind of early 20s. It's kind of hard to determine this. I don't have any kind of direct evidence as to like when they stopped performing. Looking at the Samahang Gabriel, personnel list for a lot of these zarzuelas, you see a lot of artists moving from one company to another, or kind of, I think it's kind of really interesting. It kind of reminded me of my orchestra days, where like there's multiple orchestras by name, but a lot of the musicians actually, go from one orchestra to another, right? So it's kind of an interesting, similar kind of scene, right? Bernardino Benaventura, I think, also had his own kind of company, or at least were producing zarzuelas prior to Samahang Gabriel, or kind of separate to Samahang Gabriel, and then he later kind of joined Samahang Gabriel. I think Eusebio and Feliza are married, I believe. And I think Feliza and Bernardino are actually siblings, right? So there's a lot of these kind of connections and networks via, family, kind of family networks, right? That is kind of also interesting in terms of, Hermahenes Ilagan also, I forgot to mention, the Ilagan company are also very active and kind of one of the long running ones, actually. If you think about Ilagan company as, the one that staged Severino Reyes' debut performances, right before Severino Reyes formed Gran Compañía as well as Tagala, there was Ilagan's company, right? And that kind of continued on in the 20s. But I think a lot of the also a family kind of company, very kind of artistic. A lot of them would later on move to film. And also kind of really do the provincial kind of tours. And so I would say only a handful, about, probably less than 10, at least in Manila and in the kind of neighboring provinces. There could be more. But I think what's interesting for me is the ways in which, a lot of the artists know each other, right? And kind of, if they need someone, they can kind of borrow, or they can kind of invite other artists from other groups and be part of these productions. Thank you.
All right. And here's another one from Leslie Damaso. How much was Kundiman a part of a Sarsuela performance?
Yeah, so the repertoire I mentioned about, the kundiman along with other kind of more what we would think of as local or indigenized genres would really come up in the later 1920s repertoire. The kundimans in the Samahang Gabriel repertoire, for example, in the kind of 29 titles, I would say would almost always have at least one kundiman in its song numbers. Earlier repertoire, and as I've mentioned, it'll always be kind of these very emotional, kind of, often sung by women. What's interesting is if you actually trace kundiman in the Sarsuwela scores, the earlier ones, there's not a whole lot. One of the really interesting ones that I've kind of found is in, I'm thinking Jose Estelia's, where is it? La Venta de Filipinas al Japón from 1906, which is actually, interestingly enough, it's kind of more of a comedic song, which is really kind of contrary to our kind of, our understanding of the Kundiman, right? Where the song is talking about, the Sarsuela is about the rumors that Japan will buy the Philippines from the U.S., right? Japan coming from their victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and people were like kind of in the newspapers, it'll be kind of reported that Japan is kind of as this rising empire is going to acquire the Philippines, right? And Severino Reyes is in this Kundiman song, right, would talk about we had to learn Spanish, we had to learn English, now we have to learn Japanese, and so it's kind of an interesting setting of that commentary via Kundiman, right? And only few, I think, in the earlier repertoire, and really much more so in the later 20s, 30s. And so kind of what I'm trying to say here is that even though there's a lot of, and alongside, these jazz, these US, American, music, there was also a lot. This was also the time when Kundiman, right? When these kind of so-called, folk songs were also popularized, right? And it has kind of become part of, people's, listening, right? At this moment. Thank you for that question, Leslie.
All right. At the moment, there aren't any other questions here on the chat. There's a comment from Lisa, Dr. to be Lisa Desenteseo. Thanks, Dr. Easy, for sharing your research. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned that artists in the more conventional Sarsuela were involved in the Samahang Gabriel. I was wondering if you could speak more to how they were invited, quote unquote, into the organization, or how they became interested in it. What were, for example, the political and social structures that they had to navigate?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Lisa. I mentioned Eusebio Gabriel and Felisa Gabriel as had connections, right, to Reyes's Gran Compañía Sarsuela Tagala, and my sense is that the Severino Reyes's Sarsuela just kind of disbanded, and so they were kind of trying to find other venues and band with other artists, and then later on create their own company. And so I think this is kind of part of why in the literature, we don't know much about these repertoire and these artists, because we were kind of really focused on the earlier repertoire and Severino Reyes. And I think in terms of, the kind of economics of this, the later companies really, and I think my sense also is why, I read a lot of, commentaries of, artists were, complaints. I think Balacer complains about this, and I think other kind of writers writing during that time were saying, artists were kind of less professional, and the composers are kind of less, the standard is kind of lower. I think it's become kind of this more grassroots kind of operation, right? Where you have the playwright or the actor, the manager, they're all kind of doing multiple, roles in running the company at the same time as they're the ones front and center, right? And it's so kind of, and that's different from the earlier kind of, earlier generation where, at least in the Grand Campaña Social Tagala, where they had a lot of connections. They had a lot of political connections as well in kind of Manila's emerging, political elites. A lot of these performances were the earlier decades, right? Were, staged in like really grand, theaters and venues where, it was a very diverse audience, right? It was a very kind of class and race, right? Like there were Americans that, American colonial, bureaucrats were kind of frequenting these performances as well. Severino Reyes were actually marketing his Sarsuelas to American audiences. We have English translations of Mindamora, and some of these other plays. So there's a kind of conscious effort, right, to kind of present this as a entertainment, right, for local and kind of American colonial and other kind of nationalities who might be familiar with Sarsuela or even opera, right? And that shifts, right, and in the later generations in the 20s and 30s, where really the Samahang Gabriel was creating Sarsuela for people who knew these stories. People, were probably had similar stories, right? And we're coming from, the provinces. There's a lot of, the Provinciano coming to Manila. And so they would tour these also in the provinces. And these would really kind of reflect the tastes and the kind of sentiments of their primary Tagalog audiences at that time.
All right. Thanks for that. Here's another one from Leslie Damaso. How was the anti-colonialist sentiment usually expressed in the text? Was it forward or more hidden?
It's a very interesting question. Yeah, so I think the for the 1920s, 30s repertoire, really, there's, as I mentioned earlier, often it comes through these, kind of contrasting old tradition and new tradition, right? Where there or kind of old, kind of Filipino traditional values and the kind of American Western values. There's that kind of dynamic there, and so they kind of criticize and poke fun at, almost satirizing, the kind of fashion, right, and things like that. But it's I argue that it's more ambivalent, right? It's not as clear whether or not they're like, up in arms, calling for, for U.S. and for Americans to leave the country. There's it doesn't come. I don't get that sense, right, from the 1920s and 30s repertoire. There's even one. Sometimes they'd be kind of critical of specific American, colonial officials. Severino Reyes' earlier repertoire would have some of that, but even and this is, I think, something that I talk a little bit more in the kind of earlier repertoire, right, where you have, there was, right, the kind of subversion in Tagalog theater. Amelia La Peña Bonifacio talks about the more kind of explicit, forms of theater that were, very, vocal in calls for Philippine independence. You have Ariela Tolentino, you have Juan Matapang Cruz, and this kind of circle, right, of the earlier the earlier decade, the first decade of the 20th century, where you have plays written that were explicitly anti-colonial, right, and they got in trouble for it, right. My kind of intervention, I guess, or kind of my kind of trying to think through this history is that the Sarsuela that were contemporary during this time. These plays were they didn't have music, or at least did not have any substantial music in them. They were actually not Sarsuelas, by kind of the kind of strict definition, right? The Sarsuelas that were contemporary, like for example, Severino Reyes' Sarsuelas in the earlier decades, I think were actually I wouldn't say they're more explicitly anti-colonial. In fact, I would kind of, and I, this is the debate, and this is something that I'm kind of working through in the book, is that if you actually look at Severino Reyes's kind of political kind of affiliations, right? He was connected with the Partido Federalista, right? And so that's a very kind of different kind of idea of Filipino nationalism. In our history, it's talked of as these polar opposites of the collaborators and the subversive, the anti-colonial, the true nationalists, right? It's always often kind of in these polar opposites, and I think I kind of trying to back away from these kind of characterizations of these historical actors. I think Severino Reyes was trying to figure out what it means to be kind of, you could kind of think of it as he might be buying into this idea of benevolent assimilation, but he was really thinking through what it means for Filipinos, kind of this promise of education and the ways that he was really very, very critical of. I mean, he was anti-Spanish, right? That's definitely like kind of a quick answer. He was definitely anti-Spanish. He was definitely anti kind of the Spanish clerics, for example, who he thought were in terms of educating the Filipinos, really did a poor job of that. But yeah, I think if you actually look closely at his works, he's more kind of ambivalent in terms of U.S. colonial presence in the Philippines.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Chris, are there any questions on your part?
Yeah, none in YouTube. So we'll just
Okay, can you continue
in
the chat?
disposing the questions. There's a question here from Dr. Blanconsejo. So, Doc EC, could you describe the nature of the Samahan's audiences in terms of social class? Would this factor account for the shift to its continuity?
Yeah, I think so. The 20s and 30s definitely I talk a little bit about because Sarsuwela moves outside of the larger Teatro Zorilla, Grand the Manila Grand Opera House. It moves at least the 20s, the late 20s, 30s. Samahang Gabriel repertoire moves outside of these venues, and they go kind of more local, right? They would, and this is something that I have to kind of look into a little bit more. I was mostly able to, I have the scripts and the librettos. I think the next step in this kind of research is to go out to actually look and try to find newspaper, reviews and articles. That might be a little bit harder, since my sense is that these performances of the Samahang Gabriel really moves to smaller venues, to kind of the nearby provinces. Hermogenes Ilagan's Compania also kind of moves to the provinces. For a while, I think they were hired by La Dicha, which is I think a cigarette manufacturing company. And so wherever La Dicha would tour, right, would go in the provinces and try to sell their products, Hermogenes Ilagan's company would kind of mount performances as part of kind of a commercial kind of operation, right? And so it really moves to kind of outside of Manila at this time. And so I think that that's definitely a continuation, right? But unfortunately, the way that we kind of people who have written about this have tried to look at Severino Reyes, tries to kind of look and kind of keep looking in the same sources, and so and then kind of concludes that the Sarsuwela was no more, because now we're all seeing cinema advertisements, and I think I didn't get to mention film. Actually, Nick De Ocampo talks a little bit, and I agree that the early history of cinema has a stronger connection with Sarsuwela, where cinematographs would be played in between acts of Sarsuelas, for example. Of the scholars have talked about the Walang Sugat, for example, in other kind of earlier Sarsuelas, the Lagang Bukid were shot right in film. So there's a stronger kind of link and connection there with cinema and Sarsuela.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Isi. Ma'am Pat, would you like to proceed with the next question?
This is from Leo, Mar, Edredin to everyone. Congratulations to the speaker and organizers. Dr. Isi, what do you think is the role of sound recording technology in the early 20th century on the differentiation and reception between the musical stage and musical film art forms? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that really wonderful question. I think I would kind of I'm thinking that for the early 20th century audience, there might not be a kind of a bigger kind of separation between different performance platforms, right? Especially in the kind of earlier like teens, 20s. Most of the recordings that we have would come from Sarsuela stages, right? Our and I think Lisa De Centeseo might have talked a little bit about this, and also Renata Lucas in the kind of early Filipino music discography, right? We have Maria Carpena, right, the artist of the Sarsuela stage, recording Ang Maya as the early. It's kind of touted as the first recording, right, in the Philippines, and that's from Sarsuela, right? And so a lot of the content, the musical content, and the artists that did recordings were from the Sarsuela stage, right? And I think in terms of whether or not that was differentiated by kind of the early audiences or the ones that were listening, I think that it kind of were just part of the soundscape of early 20th century Philippines. I think there might be, aside from, and you might want to check if you're kind of interested in this and pursue this kind of question about sound recordings. Spotswood has a long list of recordings, early kind of 20s, 30s recordings of Filipino music, and that includes Tagalog music. There's some Cebuano, right, Visayan music, and other kind of Philippine language musics. And aside from Sarsuela stage, there are also kind of the recordings of folk songs. And so I don't know if that kind of completely answers your question, but I think in film, since this is kind of another kind of gap, right, in the literature, it's hard to kind of do comparisons because we don't really have a whole lot of film music, right, that's extant, right? So that's kind of something that would need further research. But I mean, definitely Sarsuela, music was very much a part of that the emerging sound recording industry in the Philippines, and it was probably like a huge part of its kind of of the boost in sales and the boost in kind of recognition of artists, right? It's because of this kind of connectedness between the Sarsuela stage and sound recording.
Thank you, EC. Anything else? Any other questions? There's a comment here from Dr. Buen Consejo. Thank you. Quite true. I think even now with the gig musicians traversing all kinds of spaces. And there's a question from Dr. Arwin Pan. Thank you for sharing your research. Given the emergence of other entertainment forms in the early 20th century, how did zarzuelas maintain their audiences?
Yeah, I think for the Samahang Gabriel, I would also kind of, I think the answer to that is that, especially kind of in the provinces, right? I mean, there would be in some kind of bit more urbanizing, barrios or towns. I haven't kind of quite gotten into kind of the research on this, but a lot of where the Samahang Gabriel would be performing are places where people don't really have access to films, and so Sarsuwela still was their kind of main form of entertainment. I think the same goes with the ways that we think about comedia, right? Comedia is still happening, right? It's not because you have all these other forms of entertainment and kind of media technology, the ways that we talk about this usurp this or kind of replace this, and I think that's kind of a myth, right? And so I think for the Sarsuwela in the 1920s and 30s, I think that still was, still holds true. I do have to say that it kind of ends there, right? Post-war, and Amelia La Peña Bonifacio talks a little bit about this kind of problems with mounting Sarsuelas in places like Bulacan, for example. I mean, that really is when the Sarsuela kind of declined, right? With really the kind of radio and film technologies really was more kind of emerging at that time. But I think my kind of own kind of the way that I'm kind of telling this story is it doesn't come earlier. It doesn't come sooner. There's still kind of a lot of things happening right in the 20s and 30s with the Samahang Gabriel especially.
Thank you, Izzy. Thank you from Leo. Thank you for your commentary earlier on high versus low art touched on this. And any other questions on your part, Dr. Chris?
Yeah, none in YouTube. I'm just wondering, Dr. Easy, you see the present day game shows, just wondering like Itbulaga and those other shows as sort of a still sort of modern day Sarsuela because they have set numbers, dances, etc., singing, and I mean, how do you see this sort of modern day like television shows?
Yeah, I think it's more of like a kind of more of like a variety show. It's probably closer to if you're kind of thinking about connections in terms of format. It's probably closer to vaudeville or kind of variety shows more than the Sarsuelas. Sarsuelas would have stories, narratives that are running through out the entire performance, right? And so it is closer to películas, films, radio dramas. I mean, the sentimentality, probably, the kind of some of the melodrama that happens in between, right? And the music and how the music is kind of used sometimes when you're kind of, some of the criticisms of kind of the more modern day, variety shows or kind of, talks a little bit about, you bring in someone who's poor, right? And kind of, ask them about their story, and then you give them money or kind of, it's a prize and there's a contest and there's a kind of music that's playing on the background to add to, our kind of sense of, sympathy or empathy with the contestant. And maybe that's kind of a kind of some similarities there, but I think it's kind of different in that it's not telling you a story, right? Kind of an arcing story throughout. But yeah, thank you for your question, Professor Monica.
Any other comments and questions?
Yeah. Ikaw, Dr. Pat, may question ka ba for Izzy?
Well, I'd like to ask Izzy, I mean, after the 30s and the 40s, the Zarzuela sort of disappeared until it was revived in the 1960s by the Zarzuela Foundation of the Philippines. And then there were attempts to present some Zarzuelas, but it did not really catch on. And of course, it cannot possibly attain the popularity that it had before the war. How do you see it being revived now in the 21st century? How would it be like? How do you envision a revival of a Zarzuela at this time?
Yeah, so I kind of want to answer that kind of in two parts, right? The first one is when we think about Sarsuwela, right? And this is kind of really very important, is that the Sarsuwela developed, right? The repertoire of the earlier decade, the Severino Reyes kind of generation, that Sarsuwela is different from the Sarsuwela of, let's say, the 20s and 30s of the Samahang Gabriel, kind of in terms of stories, but also sonically. I think the music part is kind of crucial here. And so when you talk about the revival, it's going to be a revival of what repertoire, right? And when you talk about kind of the revival of Sarsuwela as a kind of more abstract genre, I would actually kind of posit that the new musicals, right, of contemporary, what we have are kinds of, that's our musical theater, right? That's our kind of Sarsuwela for today, right? When they tried to revive the Sarsuelas of Severino Reyes in the 70s, the Sarsuwela Foundation, for example, when they tried to revive it, it's a kind of an interesting, in the program notes of Minda Mora, they said, the music, it's hindi papatok it's not, going to catch on in this new audience. So, and that's, they explicitly said that in their kind of, as they were trying to restage this. And so we used new music, or we solicited new artists, new composers. I think Mike Velarde was involved in this, and they created new music for the Sarsuwela for the contemporary audience, right? And so there's this kind of really concerted effort into kind of reflecting, modern tastes, modern musical taste, or new musical tastes, right? Contemporary audiences' musical taste, and that is true to tradition, right? That's what was moda, right? That's what was popular. That's what the popular music of that time, right? And so I think in terms of revival, I mean, I could see kind of very creative ways in which we could actually revive the older repertoire, right, in terms of doing a kind of more historical, quote unquote, kind of performance, where I'm actually just to kind of share a few more of our current project I'm working with. I don't know if Robin Estrada is here. I'm currently working with composer Robin Estrada in coming up with a critical edition of Severino Reyes' Minda Mora, right, as a kind of scholarly, but also something of more of a practical kind of project where perhaps production companies or university companies would be able to look at this as a historical document and say, look, this is from another time, another era. It's kind of reflecting that time, but how can we kind of turn this into something that could comment on comment about our contemporary kind of concerns and questions, right? And so that's kind of part of the work. Thank you for that, Professor.
Okay, so it is exciting to know that there will be a critical edition of Sarsuwela scores coming up in the future. That the next step, hearing the music and watching the performances.
Yeah, okay. We're actually looking for publishers. So if you know of anyone who might be interested, please don't hesitate to contact me. So.
All right, so that's a call to everyone here. Publishers wanted. All right. Any other questions or comments? And Dr. Chris?
Yeah, just a reaction here from
yes.
Dr. Jojo. Yes, jukebox musicals. I'm referring to Isy's earlier comment. Okay. Is there any other question? Or you can, if you don't want to write it down, you can just say it. Feel free to unmute and ask the question. Okay, at this juncture, can we ask our Dean, Dr. Laverne de la Peña, in place of the certificate of appreciation will follow suit, but we can ask our Dean to give an acknowledgement to our speaker for today. Dean? Okay, so...
well, is a certificate with you, Chris? Or
Yeah, we will follow with the certificate of appreciation to Dr. EC. Uh, so on behalf of the graduate studies program and the musicology department.
Dean is there?
Oh, see, okay, Dean. Okay, Dean, para mo na rin binasa yung certificate of appreciation or just, say your acknowledgement or, Oh, meron pang question si Motohide. Sorry.
Go first.
Okay, nagpahabol. Sorry, Dean. Nagpahabol lang si Motohide Taguchi. Thank you for your interesting presentation. In the 1920s and 1930s, were there any human interactions in multiple fields such as Sarsuwela films, vaudeville shows, etc.? For example, Sarsuwela composers and scriptwriters participate in the creation of music and scripts for films and vaudeville shows, or composers and scriptwriters who participate in the creation of music and scripts for Sarsuwela stages.
Yes, thank you for that question, Motohide. So as I kind of mentioned, kind of very briefly, right? Nick Del Campo talks a little bit about this too, where you have the Sarsuwela company of Tita Molina, for example, the Molina Benito Sarsuwela company. Collaborated with producers Edward Mayer Gross. Actually, Tita Molina was married to Edward Gross, so again, kind of a family affair, right? Where the film company of Edward Gross, depicted the life and heroism of Rizal in film, and then they used Reyes's or Tita Molina's company, right, to do the film, right? So definitely, I think that is a kind of direct kind of connection, right? These were the artists of the day, and so definitely it only made sense that they were the ones that were then asked to and kind of became the main artists of these films. I mean, Atang de la Rama, I think is such an incredible and a huge artist, right, in the whole of Philippine culture and popular culture and Philippine art, in the ways that she navigated, Sarsuela stage, even kind of the kind of salon music, kind of earlier, kind of more so-called classical, music spaces early on, but was very much, popular in the Sarsuela stage. And because of her kind of emerging popularity in the Sarsuela, right, the Dalagang Bukid, in which she starred and became very, very popular, was then, used by Nepomuceno, right, in his film, right, touted as the first all Filipino film production, right? It was Dalagang Bukid, it was Atang de la Rama, and I forgot who mentioned this, but even in the kind of film version of Dalagang Bukid, and this was 1919, right? Pre-talkies. Even in this version, right? In some of the screenings, it was Atang de la Rama herself that was singing, right, behind the curtains, was giving voice to the film, right? And so I think I would actually even argue that her popularity on stage, right, her very presence on stage led to people actually going to the movies more, right, because they wanted to see, Atang de la Rama. And vaudeville also, I mentioned she performed with Luis Borromeo in a lot of these vaudeville circuits. She was the queen of Kandiman. Yes, she was kind of the demure Dalagang Bukid, but she also got spunk, right? She brought spunk to the vaudeville stage. I think in her some of her in her kind of collection at the National Library, there are some scripts of kind of skits that she also wrote that were kind of actually really kind of interesting and risque, right? And so you see, a more multifaceted artist, right? And so she kind of navigated, film, radio as well in kind of the post-war days. She was very much, she had her own radio show, and continued to be a really huge presence in the entertainment industry, right, up to her death in the early 90s. And so yes, there's really this kind of it's a much more kind of rich, kind of interconnected landscape, right? And I think, I mean, I work on one, Sarsuwela, and I think it's kind of interesting to see how they all kind of come together, right, in this particular moment too. I think this really the 1920s and 30s was a very rich time for that. In terms of composers and scriptwriters of films, that's something that I have yet to kind of explore. And again, I think it's kind of harder since we don't have a whole lot of materials and primary sources from this period for films, right? But I'm guessing, I mean, even the Tempestad musical example that I played for you earlier, it could also be very much, you could also very much hear it, right, in a silent film, right? It kind of has that kind of similar, sonic, it has that kind of similar sound. Sorry, I could go on and on more about this, but thank you so much for your attention and for the wonderful questions.
Okay, there's also an appreciation here from Dr. Clement of University of San Agustin. Thank you, Doc EC. Fascinating to listen, and thank you, organizers. And Motohide also says his appreciation. Okay, is there pahabol na question before we hand over to our dean?
No, Chris, Dr. Chris, go ahead, please do the honors.
Oh, okay. So, on behalf of the UP College of Music, Musicology Department, and the Graduate Studies Program, or programs, because we have the Master's and the PhD programs, we extend our appreciation for the valuable sharing of Dr. Isidora Miranda on her talk today. So everybody show emoticon of claps. Thank you so much. And we look forward to our future lectures. We have an international audience. We're so thankful that Dr. Rick Tremilio is still supporting, continuously being with us. Also, Michael Santeria, Motohide from Japan, etc. is an international audience. Maraming salamat sa lahat. Even students are here. Good. Students are very also supportive. Maraming salamat, faculty and students. Maraming salamat. And also, of course, you can still post your questions to Dr. EC. Nasa email naman. We sent you her email address. Also, it's in the poster also. And then we can follow up. You can follow up with her, your questions later on. Okay? Thank you so much. Dr. Pat, any
Yes.
more appreciation?
Well, thank you. You've said it all, Chris. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, everyone. And I hope this was a very productive session. We look forward again to EC's book in the future.
Oh, yes, yeah. Try to also UP Press.
Future.
Promote our UP Press. Okay, maraming salamat sa lahat. There are
Thank you
more
po.
notes here
Thank
for
you so
you.
much.
You can read the chat box. Ang daming appreciation note of appreciation here. You can read that.
Thank you.
Dr. Pop for hosting. Dr. Byrne, salamat.
Thank you,
Thank
Easy.
you so much. Thank you.
Oh, habol na picture. Wait. Don't stop
Oh,
for it.
ma-
Jack, can you take a picture of everyone? Or Mary Ann too. Salamat pala, Mary Ann, no? And then Jax, our technical support. Many thanks.
Thank you so much.
Nakakuha na ng picture, Mary Ann and Jack. Okay
Turn on your cameras.
Your
Turn on your video.
picture.
I want to thank some of my family here. I think they're also here. So, thank you po.
Family.
Thanks, family. Thank you, Boston family. California family.
Okay, we will email your picture.
Thank you po.
Thank you.
Congrats.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Thank you. Maraming salamat. Would you be able to actually also send me the file ng chat if possible lang po? I think it would be nice to kind of read through some of the questions again.
Yeah, I think it will be because this is recorded, so I think part
okay.
of the text is yung chat is also there. So maybe Jack
Okay,
can also
cool.
forward it to us, pictures and chat. And also, of course, nasa YouTube na, diba? We also have a YouTube live. May link that you can also
Okay, thank you po.
sa YouTube. Salamat sa
Thank
lahat.
you. Thank you, Jack and Mary Ann for helping with the
Jack. Salamat sa
technical
lahat.
stuff too. All right. Thank you, Ma'am Wika and Ma'am Pat.
Dami mo audience. Ang galing.
Oh, nga, Isi. Nice to see
Oh yeah, yeah. I shared it to Facebook. I kind of wanted to share it to friends and family also. So I'm glad they were able to come.
Yeah. Even may students in theory attended.
Oh, and I see
Oh,
my
that's
my
great.
students then in MUL, they're here.
Kasi
Yay.
dami students. Oh. Mary Ann, I hope
Yeah.
magaling ka na. Magpagaling ka, Mary Ann, ha?
Oh no.
Okay, time for lunch.
All right. Okay, ma'am. Thank you po.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bedtime for Easy.
Take care.
All right. See you. Thank
Right.
you.
Bye-bye.